would like, if I may, to take you on a strange journey.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Real Estate Realities with the Rebel Broker. My name's Robert Whitelaw, and I am the Rebel Broker. Licensed real estate broker in the state of California, member of the National Association of Realtors. But please, don't hold that against me. Welcome to another show, folks. We're halfway through the week. Hopefully everyone's well on their way to achieving their goals. It's a little bit annoying that one of my happiest things that have happened in the last week is that I've did my taxes for my business. For those of you who don't know, business taxes are due before personal taxes. And I think this may be the first year that I wasn't scrambling to get it all done by the deadline. So it's kind of nice. I can take my time, go through the motions easily. I hope tax season is as easy for you all. And of course, I still have to do the personal thing at the same time as everyone else. So I have that to look forward to. But I like having at least that part under control. We've got a couple of little, it's turning out to be a show a lot like yesterday's. There's a couple of little appetizers, I guess you could call them. A couple of news items I think are worth mentioning. But then we're going to talk a little bit more today, probably after the break, or we might even get to it just before the break, at least in terms of starting it, is doing a quick review of whether or not a condo is a good investment. Now, for those of you who have been listeners for a really long time, you know that I've never been hugely enthusiastic about condominiums. They're sort of I think they can work. It's a contradiction because my investment property in Hawaii is a condo. So there are clearly scenarios where it can be made to work, but there are things you need to be aware of. I think that the potential limitations are important. And I'll tell you, it's only circumstances like the one I currently own that would make it worth it, where I have a destination vacation spot where my folks who are going to be renting there are there's always going to be plenty of folks to rent. And as long as I'm doing my job as a property owner in terms of getting renters, jumping through those hoops, everything should be fine. But I'll tell you what, if my investments were having trouble, if I was looking for something to liquidate, that one might just be at the top of my list because I could sell it and make a decent amount of money, and then I could use that in investments that are a little easier to manage, let's say. But we'll get into that in a minute. And we'll cover it all. It's an article that we'll be covering from biggerpockets.com, which has kind of become a place I'm participating a little bit more. It's interesting to see what gets batted around, particularly in the forums. It makes it a little bit difficult sometimes to filter between the really good stuff and the not so good stuff. But I think considering different ideas is a good thing. So we'll listen to what they've got to say here in their discussion of why a condo is not a very good investment, and see if those are things you might want to put on your list if you are still wanting to do condos as an investment. And again, I don't think it's an absolute. I tend to not think it's a good way to go. But let's just at least get the cards on the table, right? Let's figure out what the concerns are. Let's create a checklist of things that we as investors need to be aware of and move forward from there, right? More information equals better deals. But let me start first, before we jump into that, with a few interesting articles. The first one I'm going to hit is from Risk Media, and it touches again on some of that debt stuff we talked about earlier this week. The title of the article is Housing Costs Take Up Biggest Share of Income Since 2010. I think those are important things to be aware of. Remember, so much of what I'm being alerted to is debt ratios and what's happening in that sector, simply because these are kind of raising the same alarms to me now that were raising alarms to me before the downturn last time. So it all feels eerily familiar. Appreciating home values and rising interest rates inflated the typical monthly mortgage payment $68 in 2016, up to $758 according to a recent analysis by Zillow, with approximately 16% of the median household income now needed for housing each month, the biggest share since 2010. Quote, as mortgage rates rise, buyers will face higher financing costs, and already expensive homes will come with even higher monthly mortgage payments. Nationally, mortgage rates still have room to grow before the share of income needed to pay the median monthly mortgage reaches the historical average, but many more expensive coastal markets are either close to or have exceeded what has been considered historically affordable. And they go on here to mention, most notably, some areas that we've talked about here. Los Angeles and Long Beach, Anaheim, San Jose, and San Francisco, California markets gobble up the biggest pieces of the pie, 43%, 42.6%, and 42.2% of the median household income in that order. Historically, housing in Los Angeles called for 35.2% of the median income. Housing costs in the Indianapolis, Indiana, and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania markets have the smallest share with 11.2%. And about 29% of the median household income is now needed for rent each month, according to the analysis. What's really interesting is, and they go on to say that the markets with rental costs comprising the biggest share of the median household income are Los Angeles, Long Beach, Anaheim, and San Francisco, and New York at 48.5%, 43.8%, and 40.5% in that order. And one reason why this is also interesting is because there was another story that came out relating to apartments. And I think we're at a point now. We're going to talk about that here in the next article. And I think these two things kind of go together well. And I'm wondering if we can't, as investors, at least on this point, agree that we may see a shift in renter preferences coming up over the next year. So let's talk about that for a sec, because I think this is an interesting one that represents a potentially big shift. So peak renter, according to Calculated Risk, there's another article that I came across relating to this that I'll, if I track it down, I'll go ahead and include it in the show notes. I'm going to use this one really as my jumping off point, but there were a couple of different articles on this subject. Now, back in 2011, the NMHC Apartment Strategies Conference in Palm Springs had a very positive atmosphere, right? There was very low new supply in terms of rental units. We're talking apartments now, and there was strong demand. And think about what was going on back then, right? We were a couple of years down the road on the downturn. Lots of folks were having to give up their homes. And of course, people need somewhere to live. And one of those options was going to be an apartment. Not the best option, but if folks were having financial difficulties, oftentimes that's the best option for them. Today, demographics are a lot less favorable than they were. And the move from owning to renting is mostly over. Multifamily construction peaked in 2015. However, more supply than demand is still coming online. Now, this is a topic we've covered a couple of times just within recent weeks relating to how much rental property is coming on market. Now, we talked about the numbers for 2015. We also talked about a huge jump in those numbers, at least in Northern California, in the Bay Area, in 2016, and a continuing release of new apartment complexes in 2017. Now, of course, you're going to want to see how this figures into your local metro area, wherever you are, wherever your investment area is, or where you are looking to invest, and particularly where you're already invested. My advice has always been that when we start to see these kinds of shifts, it's important to understand where your property sits in that spectrum of desirability, right? If we assume that a small apartment that's super cramped, you think of the worst apartment scenario, right? An 8-story building where you're crammed together like sardines, and you're paying probably very little for that. But that would be like the end where no one wants to be, right? You've got neighbors to the left of you, to the right of you, above you, and below you, and behind you. The only direction you can go to get away from having a wall shared with a neighbor is the same wall that the front door is on. And that's the least desirable scenario, right? Then at the other end would be probably single family residential up there in terms of having what folks want. so much of what's going on right now when we talk about the debt, and one reason why I think this fits in so perfectly with what we're talking about in terms of debt, is that folks are looking at where to trim the corners. Now, and I think we talked the other day about when things get really tough and owners of homes, folks who have a loan on their home, need to start making decisions on what payments do and don't get made because of their finances. That could represent a problem, right? And we talked about how that could snowball into another scenario where if we see enough folks deciding to stop making payments on their mortgages, which we saw an uptick on in this last quarter, which was one of the things that concerned us when we talked about whether or not the market is doomed. That's the owning side. On the renting side, as things get tighter, folks simply look for another place to go that costs less. Well, that dynamic, if you're an owner, if you're a property owner who's renting and you have a renter who is potentially facing a challenge of some kind, well, they may say, you know what, we simply can't afford the rent of your single family residential home anymore, or we can't stay in this one half of your duplex, or in this 1/3 of your triplex, or in this 1/4 of your quad. We need to get lower costs going on our housing. Scenarios like this should concern you because it totally changes the cost consideration for folks who are renting. Because let's move through this, and in broad terms, what we're going to see is a increase in the number of apartments for rent. Let's see. The NMHC Market Tightness Apartment Survey has been indicating looser conditions for 5 consecutive quarters. Quote, swelling supplies of apartment units are prompting big banks to pull back from new projects, forcing developers to scramble for capital in a sign that the U.S. apartment industry headed for a downturn. Fresh supply is beginning to overwhelm demand. More than 378,000 new apartments are expected to be completed in 2017, a 30-year high, according to real estate researcher Axiometrics. And they expect, at calculated risk, the vacancy rate to increase and for rent increases to slow. And if you're faced with a brand new freshly constructed apartment complex, and you're looking at the marketplace and you're seeing existing apartments that are similar in terms of amenities to you not being fully rented at, say, $400 a month, well, what do you do? Well, for an awful lot of these apartment complexes, particularly the larger ones, it's really a software issue. They enter in, they find out, they survey what other apartment complexes are charging for various sized apartments, and they'll try to find out how many vacancies they currently have, and they plug this into their system, and it gives them a competitive number to go with, or it's done just by the person and just trying to figure out what the competition is. And the net result is lower rents for these apartments. So you as a property owner, as someone who is working with the public in trying to provide housing, you need to be aware that there may be a shift in the marketplace relating to competition. Now, I've been referring mostly to single-family residential folks who own a property and are renting it. But and this is going to dovetail on what we talk to in a minute, if we're a condo owner and we're looking at this kind of competition, that is huge because in the mind of most renters, there's very little difference between a condo and apartment. In fact, vast numbers of condos, particularly in California, started off life as apartments, and then they got converted into condos at some point. So that is a huge one, and that is one element of why I think condos are not that great of an option because of just how much they share in terms of desirability with apartments, and that's a bad thing, and particularly with the changes we're seeing now, potentially a very bad thing. Now, we're going to get into that a little bit more, talk a little bit more about condos, but we're going to take a quick break right now, so we'll be back in just a minute. Don't go away. Are you ready to jump in and start your search for your first investment property? Maybe you've decided that it's time to own your own home, or maybe you're ready to sell your home and move on to something new. No matter what your goal is, the Rebel Broker can help. That's right. Aside from hosting this show, I am also the owner, broker of Whitelaw & Sons Real Estate Services right here in Silicon Valley. With over 25 years experience serving Silicon Valley, Morgan Hill, San Martin, and Gilroy, I or one of my great agents can help you achieve your goals in real estate. So if you're ready to look into taking that next step towards achieving your real estate goals, point your browser at www.soldbyrobert.com. That's www.soldbyrobert.com and get in touch. Let me show you how I will earn your business and your respect. Again, that's www.soldbyrobert.com, or you can call me at 408-852-0525. California Bureau of Real Estate ID 00984-909. Welcome back, everyone. So glad to have you with us here on this Wednesday. I hope the week is going well for you. We just discussed a little bit about how much housing costs are taking up in terms of what folks are spending. And the reason why I think this is a good time to discuss this topic is we've just talked about indebtedness. We've talked about the growing indebtedness. We've talked about how there are some indications of default in some areas as it relates to some parts of debt. We're seeing in an environment where larger numbers of people are likely to be in a position where they need to make decisions on how do they cut corners. And one area where I think that's a very viable potential area for them is in housing. We've got an awful lot of apartments that have come online, and we're getting more this year to the point where banks are actually concerned about it and are backing away from developers who want to build apartment complexes. So let's jump in now, because I think one of the biggest areas that's potentially affected by this are folks who own condos. So I thought it'd be a good time to talk about the downside of condos, not just from this standpoint, but just in general. And of course, I think any discussion like this needs to start with, well, what's your goal in acquiring a piece of property, right? There's really only two reasons to buy property of any kind. And as the article points out, one is cash flow. So hopefully every month you're getting a certain amount of cash money left over from the rent after you've dealt with all of the issues relating to the property that are yours to pay for, servicing the debt, paying the taxes, paying the insurance. If you pay for lawn care, whatever else, as a landlord, whatever you manage, if it's HOA fees, right? Because if you own a condo, there's going to be HOA fees in there. Whatever the fees are, once you've added up everything it costs you every month, and then you figure out what you're making in rent, there's hopefully a nice chunk of cash left over for you that we call cash flow. Now, the other part is capital gain. That simply means the property is worth more. So with any luck, you buy your condo on January of 2015, and by January, say $400,000, and with any luck, if things move your way, by the time you get to January 1st of 2016, that property is now worth more. Maybe it's $10,000 more. Maybe it's, who knows? Maybe the market's going crazy and it has really grown. The problem is, in both of these areas, there are challenges to the condominium that make it not so sexy an option. Now, as we talked about before, and this is something that isn't really mentioned in this Bigger Pockets article, the mental difference on the part of a renter between a condo and apartment is really almost nothing. Imagine it, really, right? If you live in an apartment, odds are you're going to have to go upstairs or get in an elevator. There's a community pool. Most likely, we're talking about a multi-story building. If you physically describe what an apartment is, you are describing a condo, by and large, right? Now, that's the typical condo. Now, there are other kinds of, because remember, a condo is in California terms, I really separate it into two buckets. There are architecturally condos and townhomes, and then there are the legal entities, I guess you could say, of what those things are. So typically, if you're in a condo association, and there are examples of these kind of scattered all throughout Silicon Valley, you are responsible for everything that happens inside the airspace of that unit. So if your toilet starts to leak, that is your fault. or your responsibility to deal with. If a pipe inside the wall starts to leak, that if it's a condo association, then you often will find that the association is responsible for dealing with that plumbing inside the wall. If it's a townhome with a homeowners association, and these can be the same, because a townhome is typically a multi-story setup. It feels a little bit more like a house. It shares walls on two sides. Usually there's a bit of a backyard associated with it, whether it's super small or not. I mean, there's usually only two walls shared. That can be organized as a condo where that's the case. But if it's not a condo organized association, then you're responsible for everything in the walls and inside the unit. You're usually not responsible for the roof. You're usually not responsible for areas outside of your immediate control. But there is a slight difference in terms of what you are responsible for as an owner. The condo that I'm thinking of, the classical consideration of what a condo is in a general term, is basically the same setup, a multi-story building where you own just the airspace within, that's confined within the walls, or confined by the walls, and you, odds are, share multiple surfaces with neighbors, a roof, a floor, and at least one wall. Unless you're on the top floor and you're on a corner unit where you would then share only with one neighbor below and one neighbor to the left or right, right? So in a townhouse, you don't typically have anyone above or below you. In a condo, you do, right? So that's how the two things break up. And in terms of desirability, from an architectural standpoint, a condo is less desirable than a townhouse. So I realize that confuses things a little bit. And one reason why it came up is I actually had a listing earlier last year that fell into that category. It was a townhome architecturally that was organized as a condo association, which really just helped define what areas you as the owner were responsible for in terms of maintenance. So I bring that up, and I hope that doesn't muddy the waters. But in any event, this type of condo that we're talking about is the one that is the closest in desirability to an apartment, right? Okay. So here are some things that make a condo problematic. Now, one of the first things is cash flow can be something that you can't really pin down for a long term. It can frequently be something that you can only pin down for a year, and there may even still be other things that might cause you problems. Condos have costs of ownership that most houses don't. For instance, the condo association. Now, of course, you can say single-family residential homes also can exist in HOAs. That is absolutely true, which is one reason why I'm not a huge fan of HOAs. But I find that single-family residential HOA membership costs are not as volatile as condo-related association costs. So that's just another amount that you really need to account for when you're doing your math. So it changes your math question. The problem is that I've noticed that those numbers tend to go up more. Let me give you an example. I own a single-family residential home that does have to pay HOA fees to maintain common areas. I pay $560-something per year for that. I've owned this home for over 10 years. Actually, 13 years. That number's never gone up. It has stayed the same the exact same time. I've owned my condo in Hawaii, which I use as a vacation rental, for coming up on 18 months, or 2 years. It'll be 2 years, July of this year. I've already had one increase. An increase happens every year. And there was discussion of a special assessment for certain work in the condo. And that's something else to mention. Now, as I've mentioned before, my family's actually been involved with this particular condo development for a long time. And one of the things that happened, I can't even recall how long ago it was, 15, 20 years ago, the condo association got the opportunity to purchase the land on which the condo is built. This is a big deal in Hawaii. You don't tend to own the land that your home sits on. I know that sounds crazy, but you tend to have it for a 99-year lease. There's a long story. If you ever want to read about it, there's some great history books on Hawaii where you can learn all about the various families that own tons and tons of real estate and they lease it out. But in any event, we got an opportunity to purchase that land. And we did. But it meant that every single owner, in order to make it happen, had to come up with thousands and thousands of dollars in order to contribute to making that happen. So two things happened. One, the HOA dues, the condo dues went up, and we had to write a check for, I'm trying to remember what it was, but our part of it, I think, was over $7,000 just for my unit, which is one of the smaller units. And how much you had to pay was based on how large your unit was. So imagine being someone who owns a condo and you rent it, and you suddenly have this $7,000 expense that you have to come up with in order to acquire the property. And if you don't do it, there could be all kinds of complications. Someone else could end up owning the land if enough folks have that problem, and it could challenge what you're paying in terms of monthly fees on everything else if someone else ends up owning that land. It opens up a whole can of worms, and some specific to Hawaii. But the point I'm making is that special assessment can happen in any condo association. If a condo associate, you're relying entirely on those who manage the association to make sure they're saving enough money to handle expenses. And even if you buy into a unit where at the time you bought, everyone was managing smartly and they were very solvent and they had tons of money saved up, it doesn't necessarily mean that a few years later, suddenly there's not as much money being saved as there was. And when it's time to replace those roofs or do other common area upgrades or regular maintenance, they don't have the money to do it, and a special assessment may be required. There could be all kinds of different things that might come up. It could be, if you're in a rural area, it may be that your septic system needs to be overhauled. And that could be, in the case of another property I'm aware of in Hawaii, which I was looking at for investment and passed on because I was so concerned about this exact issue. Thank God I did pass. Just last year, they discovered they need to completely redo their septic system. Guess what? That's a $4.5 million job. They don't have $4.5 million. So anyway, these are the things that can crop up. Now, there's more, and a lot of it isn't even really covered in the story that I'm going to link to at therebelbroker.com. But there are things that will affect your ability to sell the property. For instance, in a condo, there are going to be requirements in terms of the owner-occupied ratio of units within it. And if it doesn't meet the requirement, well, then you can't get an FHA loan there. It has to be FHA approved in order for anyone to borrow using FHA. Given the number of loans that are being underwritten by FHA, that is a huge downside for you if your condo association doesn't get renewed as an FHA approved community for lending. All right, so in terms of cash flow, we're challenged because it's hard to know what expenses might be incurred. It's hard to know how much those monthly dues are going to increase each year, and you're pretty much guaranteed they're going to go up every year, unless you're in. I've seen condo associations where that doesn't happen. Maybe it skips a year, or maybe you manage to go a few years without it going up, but then it almost always does go up. And then, of course, you're kind of left at the whim of whoever's running the association and assuming that in the upcoming years that it's going to be run as efficiently then as it was at the time that you purchased it and ran through all the assessments. And you may even have bought at a time when it was FHA approved, but now it's not. Maybe you were that one more owner who moved out and started renting it that shifted that balance between owner-occupied and not owner-occupied to the point where it wasn't going to qualify for any more FHA loans. So you have to understand the impact that could potentially have on your resale. So not only do these potential costs negatively impact your monthly cash flow, but they also affect your ability to even enjoy any appreciation. If suddenly the amount of money that your unit is going to be worth, the second it's not FHA approved, it goes down in value. Here's the other thing. just as condos, I've described them in the past as canaries in the coal mine. When it comes to a market taking a downturn, they are the first type of property to lose value. When it comes to prices increasing, they are the last properties to increase in value, at least in my marketplace. So it presents challenges on both sides of the equation, whether you want to talk about I am in this to generate cash flow, or I'm in this to generate a gain in my capital. That's really not a feeding factor. And what's really bad about something like that is this can negatively affect your other investments. If you are investing in a condo and you're simply not seeing the appreciation that you tend to see with other types of properties, there's no way you can leverage off of that equity to fuel other investment opportunities you might have, where the only benefit you're getting from that property is going to be that positive cash flow per month, which is going to be less because the costs incurred on a month-to-month basis tend to be more based on the HOA stuff. Now, sort of as a summary of really my primary concern as it relates to condos is really that lack of control. You're surrendering a huge amount of control in terms of not just being able to control your costs, because that's all up to some other group of people who are going to vote this stuff in, but it is also a problem in terms of the rules of the community. And if certain rules start to get put into effect that you don't like or you think will negatively affect the desirability of your unit to folks who would want to rent, well, you really don't have a choice. Once it gets passed, it's passed. So unless you are very involved in the committee that runs these things, which you probably aren't, your time is valuable. You're trying to invest in real estate. Having to put time aside to invest in this simply means it's costing you more, but it's costing you more in terms of the most valuable asset you have, your time. All right. So here's where we land. If we start to see what I'm suggesting, my theory is, and I think the folks at biggerpockets agree, is that you will see these things getting cheaper. You will see condo prices going down. Like I said, they're the first to go down and the last to go up. There might be a huge temptation to think about investing in condos. And for me, the only way a condo is going to work is with an awful lot of math where you have padded that with an awful lot of month-to-month cash for you. And you need to make sure you've maximized its utility to the point where you're pulling out as much profit as you possibly can. Because the other problem that I think you're going to see here is that the rate at which potential costs increase with a condo outpaces the amount you can increase the rent you're charging, at least over the long haul. So for me, what's the main reason I own my condo? I like Hawaii. If this thing was anywhere else, I probably would not own it. If I couldn't get the great deal I got on it, I wouldn't have done it. And there's just, it's great to be able to say that I have a place I can go in Hawaii whenever I feel like it. And that's nice. But in most cases, if you're doing the numbers, if you're running those numbers and figuring them out, and my suggestion is to assume, at least a 5% increase in your dues each year on these condo association fees. Make sure that you've built yourself in a window of time there, and don't assume that your property is going to necessarily increase in value. In fact, depending on what we see coming up, if you buy when it gets to the point where you think things are just awesome in terms of cheapness, in terms of low cost, well, if that's the way the market is going, and as we indicated, I often consider these properties to be the canary in the coal mine, the next step is for single-family residential homes to get cheaper. And wouldn't it be a shame to be leveraged up on a condo that now at this point is probably worth less than what you paid for it, when if you had continued to look for better opportunities relating to a single family residential, you would have probably been able to take advantage of that. So be very careful. There are potential problems. The upside is you don't have to maintain much of anything, right? It's pretty simple. You don't have to worry about you're not paying for water, you're not paying for heat, you're not paying for electricity. All of these things are going to be paid by the renter. So in terms of worrying about people coming and doing yard work and all this other stuff, that's eliminated. But you're paying a pretty good premium for that in terms of what fees you're usually paying to a condo. So just make sure you're forewarned, right? That's what it's about. It's about cranking the knowledge up to 11 so that when you're sitting down and you're comparing your various investment opportunities, you are putting together a great series of choices for yourself where condos may play a part. But it's got it for my money. It needs to have a very unique appeal, and that's one reason why the Hawaii place made sense to me. One thing we've talked about, if you've been a listener for a super long time, whenever I've talked about the appeal, identify what the appeal of a property is, and why people would go to visit if they're a vacation renter. Why would they go there? What is the primary reason? If an area is famous for golf, or there's a famous golf course, and you're looking to be something relating to a vacation rental in that area, well, proximity to that, right, is going to be the thing. What are the big draws? Well, in Hawaii, the big draw is pretty easy. It's the Pacific Ocean. So for me, if, for instance, my in on a property to purchase had been on a condo that was off the beach, maybe inland a little bit, I probably wouldn't have gone with it. I was looking for something where I knew that if what folks are looking for when they go to Hawaii is delivered absolutely right at their doorstep. And that's what this does. It delivers, you step on that balcony, the lanai, and you can almost jump in the water. The ocean is right there. There's nothing between you and the Pacific Ocean aside from some palm trees. So that's that kind of impact, that kind of understanding of what the property offers is what swayed me to believe that a condo was a good investment. And so far, so good. But as soon as things start to not go that way, I would absolutely be willing to part with that in terms of moving it into something that might be lucrative in a different marketplace. All right, folks. I hope that's been some pretty valuable info to bounce around in your head. That's what the goal of the show is, to repay you with great information for the time you have spent with me. Thanks again for listening, and I'll talk to you all next time.